Behind the golden gates of Astoria Palace, where champagne flows like water and diamonds sparkle brighter than stars, a storm is brewing that could destroy a 1,000-year-old monarchy. Queen Isabella had waited 30 years to wear the crown, but she never imagined she'd have to fight another woman for her husband's attention, especially not the beloved Princess Elena, whose grace and beauty have captured not just the king's eye, but the hearts of an entire nation. When jealousy meets power and love collides with duty, even the mightiest throne can crumble. What happens when a queen's desperate move to eliminate her rival threatens to expose the royal family's darkest secrets? In a world where every smile hides a dagger and every curtsy conceals a conspiracy, one woman's jealousy will set in motion events that will shake the very foundations of the kingdom. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Astoria Palace as Queen Isabella Montclair stood before her gilded mirror, watching her lady-in-waiting fasten a string of pearls around her neck. Each pearl was perfect, lustrous, and worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Yet as Isabella stared at her reflection, she felt anything but perfect. The woman looking back at her was 48 years old, still beautiful by any measure, but no longer the radiant 20-year-old who had captivated Prince Alexander 28 years ago. "Your Majesty looks magnificent today," Lady Margaret whispered, adjusting the Queen's sapphire tiara with practiced hands. The compliment felt hollow, routine, spoken more from duty than genuine admiration. Isabella had heard these same words every morning for the past 3 years since Alexander's coronation, but lately they felt like lies wrapped in silk. The palace bells chimed 9 times, signaling the start of another day filled with ceremonial duties, charity galas, and public appearances. But Isabella's mind wasn't on her schedule. Instead, it drifted to the woman who had unknowingly become the source of her sleepless nights and growing paranoia. Princess Elena Rosewood, her husband's cousin's daughter, who had arrived at court 6 months ago like a ray of sunshine piercing through storm clouds. Elena was everything Isabella had once been and everything she feared she was losing. At 26, the princess possessed an effortless grace that made even the most mundane activities look like poetry in motion. Her laugh was musical, her smile genuine, and her beauty the kind that artists spent lifetimes trying to capture on canvas. But it wasn't just her appearance that drew people to her like moths to a flame. It was her warmth, her authenticity, her ability to make everyone feel like the most important person in the room. Isabella had watched from the shadows as Elena charmed diplomats at state dinners, comforted grieving families during hospital visits, and spoke passionately about environmental conservation with a sincerity that made even the most cynical journalists believe in hope again. The press had dubbed her the People's Princess, and the title stuck like honey to bread. Every magazine cover, every newspaper headline, every television segment seemed to feature Elena's radiant smile and kind eyes. But it was the way King Alexander looked at Elena that truly haunted Isabella's dreams. She had first noticed it during Elena's welcome banquet, a grand affair held in the palace's great hall with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across the assembled nobility. Isabella had been seated at the high table, resplendent in emerald silk that perfectly complemented the royal emeralds adorning her throat and wrists. Alexander sat beside her, handsome as ever in his military dress uniform, the very picture of a king in his prime. Elena had worn a simple cream-colored gown that night, elegant but understated, with her chestnut hair swept up in an intricate braid adorned with small white roses. When she was introduced to the court, she had curtsied with perfect form, her eyes downcast in proper deference. But when she rose and met Alexander's gaze, something had shifted in the room's atmosphere, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. Isabella had seen her husband's expression change in that moment, a softening around his eyes, a slight intake of breath, a smile that reached deeper than his usual polite royal mask. It was the same look he had given Isabella all those years ago when they first met at a diplomatic reception in Vienna. The same look that had convinced her she was the love of his life, his chosen one, his forever. Now, 6 months later, Isabella found herself studying every interaction between Alexander and Elena with the intensity of a spy analyzing enemy intelligence. She noticed how Alexander's voice became gentler when he spoke to Elena, how he lingered a moment longer than necessary when greeting her at official functions, how his eyes would seek her out across crowded rooms as if drawn by an invisible magnetic force. The worst part was that Elena seemed completely oblivious to the effect she was having. Her interactions with the king appeared natural, respectful, and entirely appropriate. She never flirted, never overstepped boundaries, never gave any indication that she was aware of Alexander's growing fascination with her. This only made Isabella's suspicions feel more irrational and her jealousy more toxic. "Shall I inform His Majesty that you're ready for breakfast?" Lady Margaret asked, breaking Isabella from her brooding reverie. The Queen's private breakfast with the king was a daily tradition, one of the few moments in their packed schedules when they could speak privately without the constant presence of advisors, secretaries, and protocol officers. "Yes," Isabella replied, smoothing her hands over her burgundy wool dress, a color chosen specifically because Alexander had once said it brought out the fire in her dark eyes. These days, she found herself making every decision with him in mind, desperately trying to recapture the attention that seemed to be slipping away like sand through her fingers. The royal breakfast room was smaller than most of the palace's public spaces, but still grander than anything ordinary people could imagine. Tall windows overlooked the palace gardens where autumn roses bloomed in defiant beauty despite the approaching winter. A mahogany table that could seat 12 had been set for two, with bone china so delicate it seemed to glow in the morning light, and silver so polished it reflected the room like mirrors. Alexander was already seated when Isabella arrived, reading dispatches while sipping his coffee from a cup emblazoned with the royal coat of arms. Even in the informal setting of their private breakfast, he looked every inch the king, his graying hair perfectly styled, his posture straight and commanding, his blue eyes sharp with intelligence. At 52, he remained a handsome man, the kind of leader who inspired confidence and loyalty in equal measure. "Good morning, darling," Isabella said, taking her seat across from him. She had practiced the greeting in her mirror, ensuring her tone struck the perfect balance between affection and respect. "Morning, Bella," Alexander replied, using the pet name he'd given her during their courtship. He looked up from his papers and smiled, but Isabella noticed it was the polite smile he gave everyone: courtiers, foreign dignitaries, photographers. It wasn't the intimate smile reserved for lovers, the one she remembered from their early years together. They ate in relative silence, Alexander absorbed in his correspondence, while Isabella picked at her perfectly prepared eggs Benedict. She wanted to ask him about his schedule for the day, about the state dinner planned for next week, about anything that might spark genuine conversation between them. Instead, she found herself searching for an opening to bring up Elena without seeming obsessive or petty. "I saw the headlines about Princess Elena's visit to the children's hospital yesterday," Isabella finally said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. The coverage was quite positive. Alexander's face immediately brightened in a way that made Isabella's stomach clench with dread. "She's remarkable with the children," he said, setting down his coffee cup with enthusiasm. "The doctors told me she spent 4 hours reading to the cancer patients, and she remembered every child's name from her previous visit. There's something special about her, the way she connects with people. It's a rare gift." Isabella forced herself to nod and smile, even as each word felt like a small knife to her heart. "She's certainly popular with the press," she managed to say. "More than popular, she's beloved," Alexander continued, and Isabella could hear the admiration in his voice. "Did you see the footage of her comforting that little boy who was afraid of his surgery? She sat with him for an hour, telling him stories about brave knights and magical kingdoms until he was laughing instead of crying. The nurses said they've never seen anything like it." "How wonderful," Isabella said through clenched teeth, her hands tightening around her napkin beneath the table. She wanted to scream that she too had comforted frightened children, that she too had spent countless hours in hospitals and orphanages, that she too had devoted her life to charitable work. But somehow, when Elena did these things, they seemed more authentic, more meaningful, more worthy of praise. Alexander returned to his papers, but Isabella could see the slight smile that lingered on his lips as he thought about Elena's kindness to the sick children. It was a smile that used to be reserved for thoughts of her, for memories of their shared moments, for the pride he felt in her accomplishments. Now it belonged to another woman, and Isabella felt the bitter taste of jealousy rising in her throat like bile. The rest of breakfast passed quickly, with Alexander excusing himself for a meeting with the Prime Minister and Isabella retreating to her private study to review plans for an upcoming state visit. But her mind wasn't on diplomatic protocols or seating arrangements. Instead, she found herself replaying every moment of their conversation, analyzing every expression that had crossed her husband's face when Elena's name was mentioned. It was in her study, surrounded by portraits of previous queens who had faced their own trials and tribulations, that Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't continue living in fear of losing Alexander's love. She couldn't spend every day watching him fall deeper under Elena's spell while she stood helplessly by. If Elena was a threat to her marriage, to her position, to everything she had worked for, then Elena would have to be removed from the equation. The plan that began forming in Isabella's mind was dangerous, requiring careful manipulation and precise timing. She would need allies, people who could be trusted to carry out her wishes without asking too many questions. She would need to be patient, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike without leaving fingerprints that could be traced back to her. Most importantly, she would need to ensure that Elena's departure from court appeared natural, perhaps even noble, so that Alexander would never suspect his wife's involvement. Isabella walked to her private safe, hidden behind a portrait of her late mother-in-law, and retrieved a leather-bound notebook where she kept her most sensitive thoughts and observations. She had been unconsciously gathering information about Elena for months, her habits, her friendships, her family connections, her weaknesses. What had started as innocent curiosity had evolved into a comprehensive intelligence file, and now Isabella realized it was exactly what she needed to execute her plan. As she sat at her antique writing desk, fountain pen poised over fresh paper, Isabella felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed, to become the kind of person she had never imagined she could be. But the alternative, losing Alexander, losing her position, losing her identity as queen, was unthinkable. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of her study, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of palace life, servants going about their duties, guards changing shifts, gardeners tending to the grounds. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful, so completely unaware of the storm that was about to be unleashed from within these very walls. Isabella began to write, her elegant handwriting flowing across the page as she outlined the first phase of her plan. She would start small, planting seeds of doubt about Elena's motives and character. She would use the palace's vast network of servants, courtiers, and hangers-on to spread carefully crafted rumors that would slowly erode Elena's reputation. She would exploit the princess's genuine kindness, twisting it into something that appeared calculated and manipulative. But even as she wrote, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings about the path she was choosing. This was not who she wanted to be. This was not the kind of queen she had dreamed of becoming when she first married Alexander. This was not the legacy she wanted to leave for future generations of royal women who would look to her as an example. Isabella paused in her writing, her pen hovering over the paper as doubt crept into her consciousness. What if she was wrong about Alexander's feelings? What if his admiration for Elena was purely professional, the kind of respect one royal shows another? What if her jealousy was causing her to see threats where none existed, to imagine betrayals where there was only kindness? But then, she remembered the way Alexander's face had lit up when discussing Elena's hospital visit, the warmth in his voice when he praised the princess's connection with children, the smile that had lingered on his lips long after their conversation had moved on to other topics. These were not the reactions of a man offering simple professional respect. These were the reactions of a man falling in love, whether he admitted it to himself or not. Isabella closed the notebook with a snap and returned it to the safe, but not before tearing out the pages she had written and folding them carefully into her jewelry box. The plan was set in motion now, committed to paper and therefore to action. Tomorrow, she would begin reaching out to her network of informants and allies, testing their loyalty and gauging their willingness to help their queen protect her marriage and her throne. As evening fell over Astoria Palace, Isabella prepared for another state dinner, another performance of royal perfection. She would smile and charm and play her part flawlessly, as she had every day for nearly 3 decades. But underneath the diamonds and silk, beneath the practiced, gracious exterior, a different woman was emerging, one driven by desperation and willing to do whatever it took to preserve what she believed was rightfully hers. The game had begun, though Elena didn't know she was playing. The palace halls that had seemed so safe and welcoming just hours before were now charged with hidden dangers and unspoken threats. And at the center of it all sat a queen whose love had curdled into something far more dangerous than hatred, the kind of obsessive, possessive jealousy that had destroyed kingdoms throughout history. What Isabella couldn't see, as she fastened her grandmother's diamond earrings and prepared to face another evening of royal duties, was that her plan to save her marriage might very well be the thing that destroyed it forever. In her determination to eliminate a perceived rival, she was about to become the very threat to the monarchy she thought she was protecting against. The queen was ready for war, but she had no idea that the real battle would be with herself. The crystal chandelier in the palace's blue salon cast prismatic rainbows across the silk wallpaper as Queen Isabella held court with her most trusted confidants. Lady Catherine Ashworth, the Duchess of Thornbury, sat elegantly on the antique settee, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite being 73 years old. Beside her, Countess Victoria Sterling picked delicately at a petite, for while her sharp green eyes missed nothing of the Queen's carefully controlled demeanor. These were Isabella's generals in the subtle warfare of court politics, women who had survived decades of royal intrigue and understood that survival often depended on knowing which way the wind was blowing before it even began to shift. They had been summoned for afternoon tea, but Isabella knew they understood this was no social gathering. "I've been observing some concerning patterns in court lately," Isabella began, her voice pitched at exactly the right level of regal concern. She had practiced this conversation in her mind dozens of times, ensuring every word was calculated to achieve maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability. Lady Catherine raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a gesture that had intimidated lesser nobles for half a century. "Oh, what sort of patterns, Your Majesty?" Isabella set down her porcelain teacup with deliberate precision, the tiny clink echoing in the suddenly attentive room. "It's about Princess Elena. I fear her enthusiasm for royal duties may be causing some disruption to established protocols." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Isabella watched as her companions processed this information, their faces remaining neutral even as their minds began calculating the political ramifications. These women had built their positions on an ability to read between lines and understand the unspoken truths that govern palace life. "She certainly has been quite visible in the media lately," Countess Victoria observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Yesterday's hospital visit made headlines in 7 countries." "Exactly my concern," Isabella said, leaning forward slightly. "While I appreciate her dedication, I worry that such intense media attention might be overshadowing the established charitable work of other royal family members. We must maintain balance in how the public perceives our various contributions." It was a masterful opening move, framing her jealousy as concern for institutional stability, making Elena's popularity seem like a threat to the monarchy itself rather than to Isabella personally. She watched as understanding dawned in Lady Catherine's eyes, followed quickly by the calculating expression of someone recognizing opportunity. "The established order has served the monarchy well for centuries," Lady Catherine agreed slowly. "Perhaps Princess Elena would benefit from some guidance about appropriate levels of public engagement for someone in her position." Isabella felt a surge of satisfaction. The seeds were planted, and already they were taking root in fertile ground. "I had hoped you might have some thoughts on the matter. Your experience with court protocols is invaluable." Over the next hour, the 3 women engaged in a delicate dance of suggestion and innuendo, never saying anything that could be construed as openly hostile toward Elena, but steadily building a case for why the princess's behavior was problematic. They discussed theoretical concerns about media manipulation, hypothetical issues with protocol breaches, and abstract worries about maintaining royal dignity. By the time the last drop of tea had been consumed and the final crumb of cake removed, Isabella had successfully recruited her first allies in what she was already thinking of as Operation Restoration, her private code name for the campaign to diminish Elena's influence and restore proper balance to the royal household. "I trust one can rely on your discretion in these matters," Isabella said as her guests prepared to leave, "and perhaps your gentle guidance to help certain individuals understand their appropriate roles." "Of course, Your Majesty," both women replied in unison, their words carrying the weight of sworn oaths despite the casual setting. As the salon doors closed behind her departing guests, Isabella felt the intoxicating rush of action after months of passive observation. She was no longer a helpless observer watching her marriage deteriorate. She was a queen taking decisive steps to protect her realm and her position. The justification felt solid, even noble, when viewed through the lens of institutional preservation rather than personal jealousy. Meanwhile, 3 floors above in her own private quarters, Princess Elena stood before her modest wardrobe trying to choose an appropriate outfit for the evening's cultural reception. Unlike the Queen's vast collection of designer gowns and priceless jewels, Elena's clothing choices were limited by both her relatively modest allowance and her preference for understated elegance over ostentatious display. She selected a midnight blue cocktail dress that her mother had helped her choose during a shopping trip in London 6 months earlier. The memory brought a smile to her face as she remembered her mother's excitement about Elena's appointment to the royal household, the pride in her voice as she told everyone who would listen that her daughter would be serving alongside the king and queen. Elena's background was quite different from the usual royal circles. Her father, the king's second cousin, had chosen a career in medicine over court life, becoming a respected surgeon who worked primarily in underserved communities. Her mother was a former teacher who had dedicated her life to literacy programs in rural areas. They had raised Elena with a strong sense of social responsibility and a genuine desire to use whatever privileges she possessed in service of others. This upbringing was precisely what made Elena so effective in her royal duties and so beloved by the public, but it also made her largely oblivious to the subtle currents of jealousy and manipulation that flowed beneath the palace's polished surface. She approached her role with sincerity and dedication, never suspecting that these very qualities might be perceived as threats by those who had learned to navigate royal life through careful political calculation rather than genuine passion. As Elena fastened her grandmother's simple pearl necklace, she reflected on the strange sense of isolation that had begun to creep into her palace experience. Initially, she had been warmly welcomed by most of the royal household staff and several members of the extended royal family. But, lately, she had noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with her. Conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, invitations that were mysteriously withdrawn, social events where she found herself increasingly relegated to the margins. She had attributed these changes to the natural adjustment period that came with any new position, assuming that people needed time to become comfortable with her presence in their established social ecosystem. The possibility that someone might be deliberately orchestrating her isolation never occurred to her trusting nature. The cultural reception that evening was held in honor of visiting artists from the Commonwealth countries, a celebration of the diverse creative traditions that flourished under the royal patronage system. The palace's grand ballroom had been transformed into an art gallery, with paintings, sculptures, and textile works displayed throughout the space, while musicians from various cultural backgrounds provided entertainment. King Alexander moved through the crowd with his characteristic blend of authority and approachability, stopping to speak knowledgeably with artists about their techniques and inspirations. Isabella remained close to his side, playing the role of supportive queen with practiced expertise, but Elena noticed how the queen's eyes never quite seemed to engage with the conversations, instead constantly scanning the room, as if searching for something or someone. Elena found herself drawn to a display of traditional Aboriginal paintings, their vibrant colors and complex symbolic meanings fascinating her artistic sensibilities. She was deep in conversation with the artist about the spiritual significance of various design elements when she became aware of King Alexander approaching their group. "Your Majesty," the artist said, bowing respectfully as the king joined their conversation. "Please, continue your explanation," Alexander said warmly. "I was hoping to learn more about the connection between these visual patterns and your cultural storytelling traditions." What followed was an engaging discussion about art as a vehicle for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge across generations. Elena found herself contributing observations about similar traditions she had studied in other Commonwealth nations, while Alexander asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated both genuine curiosity and impressive background knowledge. It was exactly the kind of meaningful cultural exchange that such events were designed to foster, and Elena felt the familiar satisfaction of seeing royal patronage working as intended, bringing together diverse voices and creating opportunities for mutual understanding and appreciation. What Elena didn't notice was the way Queen Isabella watched their interaction from across the room. Noting how animated Alexander became when discussing art with Elena, how their conversation seemed to flow naturally despite their different backgrounds and ages, how other guests gradually gravitated toward their group, drawn by the obvious enthusiasm of the participants. Isabella also noted the way several photographers captured images of Alexander and Elena engaged in animated conversation, their body language suggesting mutual respect and intellectual compatibility. These were exactly the kinds of photographs that would appear in tomorrow's newspapers with captions about the royal family's commitment to cultural diversity and artistic patronage. But Isabella saw something different in those images. She saw her husband and another woman sharing the kind of passionate intellectual connection that had once been the foundation of her own relationship with Alexander. She remembered their early years together when they would spend hours discussing philosophy, literature, and social issues, their conversations ranging far into the night as they discovered their shared values and complementary perspectives. When had those conversations stopped? Isabella couldn't pinpoint exactly when their discussions had become dominated by schedules, protocols, and administrative details rather than ideas and dreams. Somewhere along the way, the woman who had captivated a prince with her intelligence and passion had been replaced by a queen focused primarily on maintaining appearances and managing responsibilities. The realization hit Isabella like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily breathless in the middle of the crowded ballroom. She had been so focused on Elena as an external threat that she hadn't considered the possibility that the real problem might be internal, that perhaps Alexander wasn't falling in love with Elena so much as he was rediscovering aspects of himself that he had lost in their marriage. But, rather than leading to self-reflection or an attempt to rekindle the intellectual intimacy she had once shared with her husband, this insight only intensified Isabella's determination to eliminate Elena from the equation. If Alexander was using Elena to reconnect with parts of himself that had been dormant during his marriage, then removing Elena would force him to seek that connection elsewhere, hopefully back to his wife. The logic was flawed, driven more by desperation than reason, but Isabella was too deep in her jealousy spiral to recognize the faulty premise. Instead, she began mentally cataloging every moment of the evening when Alexander and Elena appeared engaged in meaningful conversation, building her case for why the princess's presence was disrupting the natural order of royal relationships. By the end of the evening, Isabella had convinced herself that immediate action was necessary to prevent further erosion of her marriage. She spent the remainder of the reception subtly positioning herself between Alexander and Elena whenever possible, inserting herself into their conversations, and redirecting the king's attention to other guests and topics. Her interventions were skilled enough to appear natural to casual observers, but Elena began to notice a pattern in how conversations seemed to be interrupted whenever she and the king were discussing topics of mutual interest. She attributed it to the queen's dedication to ensuring all guests received royal attention, not realizing she was witnessing the early stages of a carefully orchestrated campaign against her. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Elena felt the complex mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that came with successful royal events. She had made meaningful connections with several artists, learned about cultural traditions she had never encountered before, and contributed to what she believed was effective royal diplomacy. But she also carried a vague sense of unease that she couldn't quite identify, a feeling that something had shifted in the palace atmosphere without her understanding what or why. It was like sensing a storm approaching while still standing under clear skies. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but some instinct warned of approaching turbulence. In her private chambers later that night, Isabella sat at her writing desk composing what appeared to be routine correspondence, but was actually the next phase of her campaign. She crafted carefully worded letters to influential friends in media circles, social columnists who owed their access to royal events to her continued favor, and society photographers whose careers depended on maintaining positive relationships with the palace. Each letter was a masterpiece of subtle suggestion, never directly criticizing Elena but raising questions about appropriate boundaries for junior royals, hinting at concerns about protocol breaches, and subtly implying that perhaps too much media attention on any one individual might not serve the monarchy's broader interests. Isabella's years of experience in royal politics served her well as she navigated the delicate balance between influence and exposure. She knew exactly how to plant ideas in receptive minds without leaving traceable evidence of her involvement. By morning, several key figures in London's social and media circles would be viewing Elena's activities through a newly critical lens, looking for signs of the concerning behavior their beloved queen had so diplomatically brought to their attention. The chess pieces were moving into position, and Isabella felt the dark satisfaction of a general watching her strategy unfold according to plan. She had no way of knowing that her campaign would eventually spiral far beyond her control, or that her determination to save her marriage might ultimately be the very thing that destroyed it. All she could see was the immediate goal: removing Elena from Alexander's orbit and restoring what she believed was the natural order of their royal household. As midnight chimed from the palace clock tower, both women prepared for sleep, neither fully aware of the battle lines that had been drawn between them. Elena drifted off thinking about art and cultural exchange, while Isabella lay awake perfecting her plans for psychological warfare. The palace settled into its nighttime quiet, but the seeds of future chaos had been planted in the fertile ground of jealousy and desperation. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for both women to pursue their respective visions of royal service, but they would be operating under very different rules of engagement. Elena would continue approaching her duties with openness and sincerity, while Isabella would begin implementing a sophisticated campaign of reputation management disguised as concern for institutional stability. The tragedy was that both women were fundamentally decent people who had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control. Isabella by decades of royal pressure and the gradual erosion of her identity outside her role as queen, Elena by a genuine desire to serve others, and a trusting nature that couldn't imagine the sophisticated manipulations that were about to be unleashed against her. The palace, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of stability and continuity, was about to become the battleground for a very personal war that would test the fundamental values upon which the monarchy claimed to rest. And at the center of it all was a love triangle that none of the participants had consciously chosen to create, but which would ultimately reveal the true character of everyone involved. The morning newspapers arrived at Astoria Palace, as they had every day for centuries, delivered by discreet staff members who arranged them precisely on silver trays in the royal breakfast room. But this particular Tuesday morning brought with it the first visible fruits of Queen Isabella's carefully planted campaign, and the headlines made her pulse quicken with vindicated satisfaction. Royal protocol questions raised, read the headline in the Palace Tribune, the most conservative of the major newspapers, and one whose editor Isabella had cultivated for years. The article, buried on page 4 to maintain editorial credibility, raised gentle but persistent questions about whether certain unnamed junior royals might be overstepping traditional boundaries in their eagerness to serve the crown. The piece was a masterwork of journalistic suggestion, never mentioning Elena by name but including enough specific details, references to recent hospital visits, and unusual media attention, that any informed reader would immediately understand who was being discussed. The author, a society columnist whom Isabella had strategically befriended at a charity auction 3 years earlier, had woven together half-truths and selective quotations to create an appearance of growing concern among palace insiders. Isabella folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside just as King Alexander entered the breakfast room, his usual punctual timing unchanged despite the brewing storm. He moved with the confident stride of a man comfortable in his own skin, his graying temples and slight lines around his eyes only serving to enhance his natural authority rather than diminish it. "Good morning, darling," he said, settling into his chair and reaching automatically for his coffee. "I trust you slept well." "Reasonably," Isabella replied, though in truth she had spent most of the night alternating between excitement about her plan's progress and anxiety about its potential consequences. "Have you had a chance to review today's papers?" Alexander shook his head, already absorbed in the stack of government briefings that accompanied his breakfast every morning. "Nothing urgent, I hope. My schedule is particularly packed today with the trade delegation from Singapore." Isabella felt a moment of hesitation. Once she drew his attention to the articles, there would be no taking back this step in her campaign. But the image of his face lighting up when he discussed Elena's work strengthened her resolve. "There's an interesting piece about royal protocols in the Tribune. You might want to glance at it when you have a moment." She watched carefully as Alexander set aside his briefings and picked up the newspaper, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused attention as he read. His brow furrowed slightly at the article's implications, and Isabella could practically see him processing the subtext and considering the potential ramifications for the royal family's public image. "This is concerning," he said finally, setting the paper down with deliberate care. "Though I notice the author hasn't provided any specific examples or sources for these alleged protocol concerns." Isabella forced herself to maintain a neutral expression even as she internally celebrated his reaction. "Perhaps that's because the concerns are preliminary?" Sometimes people hesitate to go on record about sensitive institutional matters. Or perhaps, Alexander said, his tone sharpening slightly, there's less substance here than the author would like us to believe. I've seen this kind of speculative reporting before, Bella. Usually, it stems from someone with an agenda rather than legitimate institutional concerns. The response wasn't quite what Isabella had hoped for, but she recognized it as the natural skepticism of an experienced leader who had dealt with media manipulation throughout his reign. She would need to be patient, allowing multiple sources to reinforce the same themes before expecting Alexander to take decisive action. Of course, she agreed smoothly. I'm sure you're right. It's probably nothing more than the usual media speculation. But, as Alexander returned to his briefings, Isabella noticed he didn't immediately dismiss the newspaper. Instead, he folded it and placed it in his briefcase, presumably to review more thoroughly later. The seed had been planted, and even if it hadn't immediately taken root, it was there in his mind, ready to germinate when additional evidence presented itself. 3 floors above, Princess Elena was having her own morning routine disrupted by unexpected developments. Lady Sarah Whitmore, her assigned private secretary, and one of the few palace staff members Elena considered a genuine friend, knocked on her door with unusual urgency. Your Majesty, Lady Sarah said as she entered, using the formal address that Elena still found uncomfortable after 6 months. I'm afraid we need to discuss some changes to your schedule. Elena looked up from the charity briefings she was reviewing, immediately noting the tension in Sarah's usually composed demeanor. What kind of changes? Several of your upcoming engagements have been postponed, Sarah said carefully, consulting her tablet with obvious discomfort. The children's hospital visit scheduled for Thursday has been moved to next month due to what they're calling administrative restructuring. The environmental summit you were meant to keynote has selected a different speaker, citing concerns about maintaining political neutrality. And the Literacy Foundation has requested that we postpone your school visits pending review of their royal patronage policies. Each cancellation hit Elena like a small blow, and she found herself struggling to process the implications. These weren't minor social events or routine appearances. They were meaningful engagements she had been looking forward to, opportunities to contribute substantively to causes she cared deeply about. Did they provide any additional explanation? Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. Sarah's expression grew even more uncomfortable. The communications were all quite formal and diplomatically worded, but there seems to be a common theme about ensuring proper protocols are followed and maintaining appropriate institutional balance. Elena stared at her secretary, the words echoing strangely in her mind. She had been meticulous about following all established protocols, had worked closely with the palace's protocol office to ensure every appearance met appropriate standards, had specifically requested guidance precisely to avoid any appearance of overstepping her position. I don't understand, Elena said finally. Have I done something wrong? Has someone complained about my conduct at these events? Not that I've been told, Sarah replied, but her hesitation suggested there were undercurrents she wasn't fully sharing. The official communications don't cite any specific concerns, just general references to policy reviews and scheduling adjustments. Elena felt the familiar frustration of trying to navigate institutional politics without understanding the underlying rules of engagement. Her parents had prepared her well for the practical aspects of royal service: how to speak publicly, how to interact gracefully with diverse groups, how to represent the monarchy with dignity and sincerity. But they hadn't prepared her for the possibility that competence and dedication might somehow be perceived as threats rather than assets. What does this mean for the upcoming state visit preparations? Elena asked, thinking of the elaborate cultural exchange program she had been helping to coordinate with the visiting South African delegation. Sarah consulted her tablet again, clearly dreading her response. You're still officially involved, but your role has been reduced. Instead of co-hosting the cultural reception, you'll be attending as a guest. The speech you were preparing about Commonwealth artistic traditions has been reassigned to the Duchess of York. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Elena processed this information. The cultural reception had been her primary contribution to the state visit, months of preparation and research distilled into what she had hoped would be a meaningful celebration of shared heritage and artistic collaboration. Having that responsibility stripped away felt like a professional rebuke whose cause she couldn't fathom. I see, Elena said quietly, though she didn't see it all. Thank you for letting me know, Sarah. I suppose I should review my calendar to see what other commitments might be affected. After Sarah departed, Elena found herself staring out her window at the palace gardens where autumn was painting the leaves in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. 6 months earlier, she had stood at this same window feeling overwhelmed by the honor of serving alongside the royal family and the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to causes she believed in. Now she felt adrift, uncertain of her position and confused about what had changed in the palace dynamics. She tried to analyze her recent activities for any missteps or protocol violations that might have triggered this apparent cooling in her welcome, but nothing stood out as obviously problematic. If anything, she had been careful to err on the side of caution, frequently checking with senior staff about appropriate procedures and boundaries. The isolation Elena had been sensing gradually over recent weeks suddenly crystallized into a more concrete understanding. She was being systematically excluded from significant aspects of royal life, but in ways that maintained plausible deniability about the motivations behind these decisions. It was sophisticated and subtle, the kind of institutional pressure that could be explained away as routine administrative adjustments while effectively marginalizing her influence and visibility. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella was holding court in her private study with Lord Geoffrey Pemberton, the palace's deputy private secretary, and a man whose career had been built on understanding the intricate relationships between royal family members, government officials, and media representatives. Lord Pemberton possessed the invaluable ability to communicate complex political situations through carefully chosen euphemisms and diplomatic language. "I understand there have been some scheduling adjustments for Princess Elena," Isabella said, settling into her chair with the graceful authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Indeed, Your Majesty," Lord Pemberton replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Several organizations have requested additional time to review their engagement protocols, which has naturally resulted in some calendar modifications." Isabella appreciated the delicate phrasing that avoided any direct acknowledgement of her behind-the-scenes influence, while confirming that her wishes were being implemented. "I trust these adjustments are being handled with appropriate sensitivity to all parties involved." "Of course, Your Majesty. We're ensuring that any changes appear to be routine administrative decisions rather than policy shifts. The princess's dignity and reputation remain fully protected while institutional needs are addressed." The conversation continued in this vein for another 20 minutes, with Isabella and Lord Pemberton discussing Elena's gradual marginalization through the kind of coded language that allowed both participants to maintain plausible deniability about their true intentions. No direct orders were given, no explicit criticisms were made, but the desired outcome was clearly communicated and acknowledged. What made the situation particularly effective was that it exploited the natural caution of large institutions when faced with potential controversy. Isabella hadn't needed to provide specific evidence of Elena's supposed transgressions. Simply raising questions about protocol compliance and institutional balance had been enough to make various organizations reassess their relationships with the princess. In a world where royal patronage was highly valued but also carefully regulated, the mere suggestion of palace concern was sufficient to trigger protective responses. As afternoon arrived, the effects of Isabella's campaign began rippling outward through London's interconnected social and media networks. The Palace Tribune article had been noticed by other publications, not as a story worth republishing, but as a signal that certain topics might be worth exploring. Society columnists began asking subtle questions about royal protocol adherence. Photographers started scrutinizing their archives for images that might support narratives about boundary crossing, and social media influencers who depended on royal content began adjusting their coverage to avoid potential palace displeasure. Elena, unaware of these broader movements but increasingly conscious of her shifting position within the palace hierarchy, decided to seek counsel from one of the few people she trusted to provide honest guidance. She requested a private meeting with Lady Margaret Thornfield, King Alexander's elderly aunt and a woman whose 7 decades of royal life had given her unparalleled insight into palace dynamics. Lady Margaret received Elena in her private sitting room, a cozy space filled with family photographs, fresh flowers, and the comfortable furniture of someone who had earned the right to prioritize personal taste over institutional grandeur. At 78, Lady Margaret possessed the rare combination of institutional memory and personal independence that made her both incredibly valuable and occasionally dangerous to those who preferred palace politics to remain opaque. "You look troubled, my dear," Lady Margaret observed as Elena settled into a chintz-covered armchair. Palace life not quite what you expected? Elena had intended to approach the conversation diplomatically, but Lady Margaret's direct manner and kind expression made her drop her careful composure. I feel like I'm failing at something, but I can't understand what. Things that were working well suddenly aren't. Opportunities that were offered are being withdrawn, and I can't identify what I've done wrong or how to fix it. Lady Margaret studied Elena with sharp blue eyes that had observed decades of royal intrigue, her expression growing more serious as she processed the young woman's distress. Tell me about specific incidents. When did you first notice these changes? For the next hour, Elena detailed the gradual shift in her palace experience, the canceled engagements, the reduced responsibilities, the sense of growing isolation despite her continued efforts to fulfill her duties with competence and grace. Lady Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of how palace politics functioned beneath their polished surface. I see, Lady Margaret said finally, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. Elena, my dear, I don't believe your difficulties stem from anything you've done wrong. Rather, I suspect you may have done something quite right, and that success has made certain people uncomfortable. Elena looked confused. I don't understand. Success in royal service is supposed to be celebrated, isn't it? Lady Margaret's laugh was gentle but tinged with sadness. You would think so, wouldn't you? But palace life can be more complicated than that. Sometimes being too effective, too popular, or too accomplished can be perceived as threatening by those who feel their own positions might be diminished by comparison. The implication hung in the air between them, too significant to be stated directly, but too obvious to be ignored. Elena felt a chill of understanding as she began to grasp the possibility that her troubles might not be the result of professional failure, but of personal jealousy masquerading as institutional concern. What should I do? Elena asked, feeling lost in a world whose rules seemed to shift without warning or explanation. Lady Margaret was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing her response carefully. You must decide whether you're willing to fight for your position or whether retreat might serve your long-term interests better. But understand this, if someone is working against you, they've almost certainly been planning their campaign longer than you've been aware of the problem. That puts you at a significant disadvantage unless you're prepared to engage in the same kind of strategic thinking. Elena left Lady Margaret's chambers feeling more disturbed than enlightened. The conversation had confirmed her growing suspicion that she was caught in some kind of palace intrigue, but it had also made clear that navigating such situations required skills and knowledge she simply didn't possess. Her parents had raised her to approach problems with honesty and direct communication, but those virtues seemed inadequate for the shadowy world of royal politics where intentions were masked and attacks came disguised as administrative adjustments. As evening approached and the palace prepared for another formal dinner, Elena found herself facing a choice that would define her future relationship with royal life. She could accept her marginalization gracefully, allowing herself to be gradually phased out of significant responsibilities until her presence became purely ceremonial. Or she could try to understand the forces working against her and develop strategies to counter them, even if it meant learning to operate according to rules she found morally questionable. The dinner that night would prove to be a turning point, though not in ways that anyone anticipated. Queen Isabella's campaign was about to encounter its first serious obstacle, and the consequences would force all three members of this royal triangle to confront truths they had been avoiding about themselves and their relationships with power, love, and moral compromise. The grand dining hall at Astoria Palace had hosted countless state dinners throughout its 300-year history, but tonight's gathering in honor of the South African delegation carried an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air beneath the cathedral high ceilings. Queen Isabella surveyed the scene from her position at the high table, her emerald silk gown and diamond tiara creating an image of absolute royal authority, while internally, she battled a growing sense that events were beginning to slip beyond her careful control. The evening had started according to plan. Princess Elena, relegated to a secondary table per Isabella's behind-the-scenes maneuvering, sat among the junior diplomatic staff and lesser nobles, visible enough to avoid causing obvious insult, but positioned where her interactions with King Alexander would be naturally limited by protocol and physical distance. Isabella had orchestrated the seating arrangement personally, using her authority over state dinner logistics to ensure maximum separation between her husband and the woman she viewed as her rival. But What Isabella hadn't anticipated was how King Alexander would respond to Elena's obvious marginalization. Throughout the first 3 courses, she noticed him glancing repeatedly toward Elena's table, his expression growing increasingly puzzled, and then concerned as he observed her reduced circumstances. During the fish course, he leaned toward Isabella with a question that made her stomach clench with dread. "Why is Elena seated so far from the high table tonight?" Alexander asked quietly, his voice carrying the tone of someone seeking clarification rather than making an accusation, but with an underlying sharpness that suggested his patience was limited. Isabella had prepared for this question, crafting what she believed was a reasonable explanation that would deflect suspicion while maintaining her image as a conscientious hostess. The South African delegation specifically requested an opportunity to interact with younger members of our diplomatic corps, she replied smoothly. I thought Elena would be perfect for facilitating those connections, given her knowledge of Commonwealth cultural traditions. Alexander nodded slowly, but Isabella could see he wasn't entirely satisfied with her explanation. His eyes continued to drift toward Elena's table, where the princess was indeed engaged in animated conversation with several South African cultural ministers, discussing what appeared to be traditional artistic practices with her characteristic enthusiasm and genuine curiosity. What Isabella couldn't have foreseen was that this seating arrangement, intended to diminish Elena's prominence, would actually showcase her abilities in a way that made them more visible rather than less. Surrounded by cultural experts and visiting dignitaries rather than familiar palace courtiers, Elena's intelligence and adaptability became more apparent, not less. She moved seamlessly between languages, demonstrated impressive knowledge of African art traditions, and facilitated connections between visiting artists and local cultural institutions with the kind of diplomatic skill that usually took decades to develop. The irony was not lost on several experienced observers at the dinner, including Lord Chancellor William Hartington, whose 40 years in government service had taught him to recognize both political maneuvering and genuine talent when he encountered them. Seated near the high table, Lord Hartington had a clear view of both Elena's animated discussions and the Queen's increasingly tense monitoring of those same interactions. The princess seems to be having quite an impact on our South African guests, Lord Hartington commented to Isabella during a brief pause in the formal conversation. I haven't seen cultural diplomacy conducted with such natural skill in years. The compliment, intended as a casual observation about successful royal representation, hit Isabella like a physical blow. She had worked so carefully to minimize Elena's role in the evening's activities, only to have that very marginalization create a stage where the princess's capabilities became even more obvious to everyone present. She's certainly enthusiastic about her duties, Isabella replied, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass against her lips. As the dinner progressed, Isabella watched with growing horror as her carefully constructed plan began to backfire in spectacular fashion. Rather than appearing diminished by her secondary seating, Elena seemed energized by the opportunity to engage deeply with visiting experts in fields she was passionate about. Her laughter carried across the dining hall, drawing attention and creating a magnetic center of positive energy that gradually began attracting other guests. By the time dessert was served, several high-ranking members of the British cultural establishment had drifted toward Elena's table, drawn by the quality of conversation and the obvious enthusiasm of the participants. What had been intended as a form of subtle exile was transforming into the evening's most successful diplomatic achievement, and Isabella could see that King Alexander was taking note of the contrast between the stilted formal conversation at the high table and the genuine intellectual engagement occurring across the room. The situation deteriorated further when Dr. Nomsom Mbeki, South Africa's Minister of Arts and Culture and the evening's most distinguished guest, rose from her assigned seat at the high table and approached Elena's group with obvious pleasure at discovering such knowledgeable discussion of her nation's cultural treasures. Your Royal Highness, Dr. Mbeki said as she joined Elena's table, I've been listening to your conversation about the connection between traditional Ndebele geometric patterns and contemporary South African textile design. Your insights about cultural continuity across generations are remarkably sophisticated. Elena stood respectfully as Dr. Mbeki approached, but her response demonstrated exactly the kind of substantive engagement that made her so effective in her royal role. Thank you, Minister Mbeki. I've been studying the ways that traditional artistic practices adapt to contemporary contexts while maintaining their spiritual and cultural significance. South African artists seemed particularly skilled at bridging those worlds. What followed was a 20-minute discussion that captivated not only the immediate participants, but gradually drew other guests into its orbit, creating an impromptu cultural symposium that became the evening's intellectual highlight. Elena's questions demonstrated genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. Her comments revealed substantial research and preparation, and her ability to facilitate connections between different artistic traditions impressed even the most experienced diplomats present. King Alexander watched this development with a mixture of pride and growing irritation. Pride in Elena's obvious competence and diplomatic skill, irritation at the realization that someone had deliberately attempted to minimize her contributions to an evening where she was clearly one of the most valuable participants. His eyes moved from Elena's animated group to his wife's increasingly strained expression, and Isabella could see him beginning to piece together implications she had hoped would remain hidden. "Perhaps," Alexander said quietly to Isabella during a moment when the general conversation had shifted to other topics, "we should join Dr. Mbecky's discussion. It seems to be generating more substantive cultural exchange than our formal presentations." Isabella felt panic rising in her throat. The last thing she wanted was to create a scene where her husband and Elena were brought together in public view, especially in circumstances that would highlight Elena's capabilities while potentially exposing Isabella's attempts at manipulation. "I'm sure they're managing quite well without interruption from the high table," she replied carefully. "We shouldn't disrupt such enthusiastic conversation." But Alexander's expression had shifted into the mode Isabella recognized as his decision-making face, the controlled, analytical look he wore when processing complex political situations and preparing to take action. "Actually, Bella, I think joining their discussion would send exactly the right message about our commitment to cultural engagement with our Commonwealth partners." Before Isabella could formulate another objection, Alexander was rising from his seat with the kind of quiet authority that made protest impossible without creating obvious conflict. Isabella had no choice but to follow, her heart pounding as she approached the group that represented everything she had been trying to prevent. Her husband and Elena engaged in exactly the kind of intellectual collaboration that had once been the foundation of her own relationship with Alexander. The conversation that ensued was simultaneously Isabella's worst nightmare and a masterclass in effective cultural diplomacy. Elena seamlessly incorporated the king and queen into the ongoing discussion, demonstrating the kind of social skill that made everyone feel included while maintaining the substantive level of engagement that had made the conversation worthwhile in the first place. Alexander contributed observations about the political context of cultural preservation, Dr. Mbeki shared insights about post-apartheid artistic renaissance, and even Isabella found herself drawn into discussions about the role of royal patronage in supporting emerging artists. For 45 minutes, the evening transformed into exactly the kind of meaningful cultural exchange that state dinners were supposed to achieve, but rarely managed. Elena's natural facilitation skills created space for everyone to contribute their expertise, while her genuine curiosity about others' perspectives kept the conversation dynamic and engaging rather than didactic or performative. Isabella watched in growing despair as she witnessed her husband rediscovering the kind of intellectual stimulation that had been largely absent from their relationship for years. But more troubling still was her own reluctant recognition that Elena's success in facilitating this cultural exchange wasn't the result of manipulation or calculated charm. It was simply the natural outcome of someone who approached her royal duties with sincere dedication and genuine interest in the subjects she was discussing. When the formal dinner finally concluded and guests began moving toward the reception hall for coffee and liqueurs, Isabella realized that her evening of careful orchestration had not only failed to diminish Elena's standing but had actually enhanced it in ways that would be difficult to undo. Every important guest at the dinner had witnessed Elena's diplomatic capabilities, her cultural knowledge, and her ability to create meaningful connections between diverse groups of people. Worse still, Isabella could see that Alexander had also witnessed these qualities, and his expression carried the satisfied recognition of someone who had just observed royal representation at its finest. As they moved through the receiving line, accepting thanks from departing guests, Isabella heard repeated praise for Elena's contributions to the evening's success. "The princess's knowledge of our artistic traditions was remarkable," Dr. Mbeki told Alexander as she prepared to depart. "She asked exactly the kinds of questions that demonstrate not just politeness, but genuine understanding." You should be very proud of her service to the Commonwealth Cultural Mission. Alexander's response made Isabella's blood run cold. Princess Elena has exceeded our highest expectations in every aspect of her royal service. She represents the very best of what our younger generation brings to their responsibilities. As the last guests departed and the royal family retreated to their private quarters, Isabella found herself facing the devastating realization that her carefully planned campaign had not only failed but had actually accelerated exactly the outcome she had been trying to prevent. In attempting to marginalize Elena, she had instead created circumstances that highlighted the princess's strengths while exposing the pettiness of the forces working against her. But perhaps most damaging of all was Isabella's growing awareness that her jealousy had blinded her to a fundamental truth she was no longer able to ignore. Elena's popularity and effectiveness weren't the result of calculated manipulation or inappropriate ambition. They were simply the natural consequences of someone approaching royal service with the kind of sincerity and dedication that Isabella herself had once brought to her role before years of political calculation had hardened her heart and narrowed her vision. In her private chambers that night, Isabella sat before her mirror as Lady Margaret helped her remove the diamond tiara that had felt increasingly heavy throughout the evening. The face looking back at her was still beautiful, still regal, still commanding respect and admiration. But it was also the face of a woman who had allowed fear and jealousy to transform her into someone she no longer recognized, someone capable of sophisticated cruelty disguised as institutional concern. "Your Majesty seemed troubled this evening," Lady Margaret observed as she carefully stored the priceless jewelry in its velvet-lined case. Isabella wanted to confess everything: her fears about losing Alexander's love, her campaign against Elena, her growing awareness that she was becoming the kind of person she had never intended to be. But the habits of royal discretion ran too deep, and she found herself unable to voice the truths that were eating away at her soul like acid. "Just tired, I suppose," Isabella replied, though she knew that Lady Margaret's experienced eyes could read the deeper distress written across her features. As Lady Margaret departed and Isabella prepared for what she knew would be another sleepless night, she faced a choice that would determine not only her future relationship with Elena and Alexander but her fundamental understanding of herself and her values. She could escalate her campaign, using more aggressive tactics to eliminate what she perceived as Elena's threat to her marriage. Or she could find the courage to examine whether the real threat might be coming from within herself, from the gradual transformation of a woman who had once been worthy of a prince's love into someone driven by fear and willing to destroy innocence in service of preserving what might already be lost. The palace settled into its nighttime quiet, but in 3 separate chambers, 3 very different people lay awake wrestling with questions that would shape their futures and the future of the monarchy itself. Elena wondered whether she had the strength to continue serving in an environment where success seemed to trigger punishment. Alexander questioned how he had failed to notice the subtle cruelties being perpetrated against someone under his protection. And Isabella confronted the terrifying possibility that in trying to save her marriage, she might have destroyed the very qualities that had made her worthy of love in the first place. The next morning would bring new challenges and new choices, but the events of this state dinner had shifted the fundamental dynamics between all 3 members of this royal triangle in ways that could never be completely undone. The careful balance of power, affection, and respect that had governed their relationships was about to undergo its greatest test, and the outcome would reveal whether any of them possessed the wisdom and courage necessary to navigate the treacherous waters they had entered. The gray November morning that would forever change the dynamics of Astoria Palace began with what seemed like routine administrative business. Queen Isabella sat in her private study reviewing correspondence when Lady Margaret knocked with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. The older woman's face carried an expression Isabella had learned to recognize as the harbinger of serious palace crisis. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret said as she closed the door behind her with careful precision, "we need to discuss a matter of extreme sensitivity. I've just received a call from Lord Pemberton, who has been contacted by several major newspapers requesting comment on some rather disturbing allegations." Isabella felt her blood turn to ice water. "What kind of allegations?" "It appears that someone has been making inquiries about Princess Elena's recent schedule changes and the circumstances surrounding them. More specifically, journalists are asking questions about whether there might be palace sources deliberately working to undermine the princess's position." The words hit Isabella like physical blows. Her carefully orchestrated campaign, designed to operate beneath the radar of public attention, was somehow becoming the subject of media investigation. Everything she had worked to keep hidden and deniable was threatening to explode into the kind of palace scandal that could destroy not just her own reputation, but the monarchy's credibility. "Do we know who's making these inquiries?" Isabella asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Lady Margaret consulted her notes with obvious reluctance. The initial investigation seems to have been triggered by Dr. Mbecky's office in Pretoria. Apparently, she was so impressed by Princess Elena's contributions to the cultural reception that she specifically requested the princess be included in follow-up cultural exchange programs. When our protocol office explained that Princess Elena's schedule wouldn't permit such involvement, Dr. Mbecky began asking questions about why such a capable representative was apparently being underutilized. Isabella closed her eyes as the full scope of the disaster became clear. Her attempt to marginalize Elena had not only failed to achieve its intended purpose, but had now attracted international attention from someone with the political standing to demand explanations that couldn't be easily deflected or ignored. "There's more," Lady Margaret continued, her voice heavy with implication. "Several staff members have apparently been contacted by journalists offering substantial sums for information about internal palace dynamics. While none have accepted these offers yet, the fact that such inquiries are being made suggests this story has significant momentum." Isabella felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. Every decision she had made in service of her jealous campaign was now threatening to explode into public view, potentially exposing not just her own actions, but the broader culture of palace politics that made such manipulation possible. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Princess Elena was having what would prove to be the most important conversation of her royal career. Lady Sarah had requested an urgent private meeting, and her usual composed demeanor had been replaced by obvious agitation and moral conflict. "Your Royal Highness," Lady Sarah began, then stopped and started again with visible effort. "Elena, I need to tell you something that may be difficult to hear, but I believe you have the right to know the truth about what's been happening to you." Elena set aside the charity briefings she had been reviewing and focused completely on her secretary's distress. Over the past months, Lady Sarah had become more than just a professional colleague. She was one of the few people in the palace Elena trusted completely, and seeing her in such obvious turmoil was immediately alarming. "What is it, Sarah? You can tell me anything." Lady Sarah moved to the window, staring out at the palace gardens as if gathering courage from the autumn landscape. The schedule changes, the cancelled engagements, the reduced responsibilities, none of it has been coincidental or based on legitimate administrative concerns. Elena felt her stomach clench with dread, even though part of her had suspected this truth for weeks. "What do you mean?" "There's been a deliberate campaign to marginalize your role and reduce your visibility," Lady Sarah said, turning back to face Elena with obvious pain in her eyes. "I've been asked to implement decisions that I knew were unfair and inappropriate, but I was told they came from the highest levels of palace authority and that questioning them would jeopardize my position." The confirmation of her suspicions hit Elena harder than she had expected. Even though she had gradually come to believe that someone was working against her, having it stated explicitly made her feel physically sick. "Do you know who's behind it?" Lady Sarah's hesitation spoke volumes before she found the courage to answer directly. "The instructions have come through official channels, but the pattern and timing suggest they're originating from someone very close to the center of palace power. Someone with the authority to influence multiple departments and the sophistication to make personal vendettas appear like institutional policy." Elena sank into her chair as the implications became clear. There were very few people in the palace hierarchy with the combination of access, authority, and motivation necessary to orchestrate such a campaign, and only one whose personal interests would be directly served by Elena's professional destruction. "The Queen," Elena said quietly, the words feeling strange and terrible as she spoke them aloud. Lady Sarah's silence was confirmation enough. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over her: betrayal, sadness, anger, and, underneath it all, a profound disappointment that someone she had respected and tried to serve faithfully could view her as such a threat that destruction seemed preferable to coexistence. "There's something else," Lady Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been contacted by journalists who are investigating these matters. They're asking very specific questions about internal palace communications and decision-making processes. I think this situation is about to become public in ways that could be extremely damaging to everyone involved. Elena stood and walked to the same window where Lady Sarah had sought comfort, staring out at the gardens where she had spent so many peaceful hours during her first months at the palace. Everything she had tried to build, every relationship she had worked to nurture, every contribution she had hoped to make, all of it was about to be consumed by a scandal she had never seen coming and couldn't have prevented. What should I do? Elena asked, feeling lost in a world whose rules had been deliberately hidden from her. That depends, Lady Sarah replied carefully, on whether you want to fight back or whether you think the cost of fighting might be too high for everyone involved. In the king's private office, Alexander was experiencing his own moment of terrible clarity. Lord Pemberton had just finished briefing him on the media inquiries and their potential implications, and the king was struggling to process the magnitude of what appeared to be unfolding within his own household. "Let me ensure I understand this correctly," Alexander said, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet that his staff had learned to recognize as a sign of barely contained rage. "You're telling me that someone within the palace has been systematically undermining Princess Elena's position through what appears to be deliberate manipulation of official processes?" "That appears to be the case, Your Majesty," Lord Pemberton replied carefully. "The pattern of decisions and their timing suggests coordination rather than coincidence." Alexander stood and moved to the tall windows that overlooked the palace courtyard, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that signaled deep thought and barely controlled emotion. For months, he had sensed that something was wrong in the palace dynamics, but he had attributed the subtle changes to normal adjustment periods and bureaucratic inefficiencies rather than deliberate sabotage. And this investigation was triggered by Dr. Becky's inquiries about Princess Elena's availability for cultural programs. "Yes, Your Majesty." Her office specifically praised the princess's qualifications and requested her participation in follow-up initiatives. When we explained that scheduling wouldn't permit such involvement, they began asking questions about our decision-making processes that we couldn't answer satisfactorily. Alexander felt a surge of anger that was different from the routine frustrations of political leadership. This was personal betrayal combined with institutional corruption, and it struck at the heart of everything he believed about honor, fairness, and moral leadership. "I want a complete investigation," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Every decision affecting Princess Elena's schedule and responsibilities over the past 3 months needs to be traced back to its original source. I want to know who gave what orders, when they were given, and what justification was provided." "Your Majesty," Lord Pemberton said carefully, "such an investigation might reveal information that could be uncomfortable for all parties involved." Alexander turned from the window, and Lord Pemberton immediately recognized the expression of a king who had moved beyond political calculation into the realm of moral outrage. Comfortable or not, the truth needs to be established. If someone within this palace has been abusing their position to persecute a member of our royal household, I will not tolerate it regardless of who might be implicated. The investigation that Alexander ordered took less than 6 hours to produce devastating results. By late afternoon, a clear paper trail had been established connecting the various decisions affecting Elena's position to a coordinated campaign that could only have been orchestrated by someone with extraordinary access to palace communications and decision-making processes. When Alexander reviewed the evidence that evening, the pattern was undeniable and damning. Every canceled engagement, every reduced responsibility, every subtle marginalization could be traced back through a network of influence and pressure that led inevitably to one source. The woman he had been married to for 28 years, the person he had trusted with his deepest confidences and greatest vulnerabilities, had been systematically destroying an innocent young woman whose only crime was being effective at her job. The confrontation, when it came, took place in the royal couple's private sitting room, the same space where they had shared countless intimate conversations throughout their marriage, where they had celebrated triumphs and weathered crises, where they had built the partnership that had sustained them through the complex challenges of royal life. Isabella knew the moment Alexander entered the room that her secret had been discovered. His face carried an expression of hurt and disappointment deeper than anything she had seen during their worst marital difficulties, and his posture suggested a man struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the person her actions had revealed her to be. "We need to discuss Princess Elena," Alexander said, settling into the chair across from Isabella with the careful control of someone managing volcanic emotions. More specifically, we need to discuss your role in orchestrating the systematic destruction of her position within our household. Isabella felt the last of her denials and justifications crumble in the face of his quiet certainty. The evidence was clearly overwhelming, and any attempt to maintain her innocence would only compound the damage she had already inflicted on their relationship. "Alexander, I can explain," she began. But he raised his hand to stop her words. "I don't want explanations," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "I want to understand how the woman I married, the woman I've loved and trusted for nearly 3 decades, could deliberately set out to destroy someone whose only offense was serving our family with dedication and competence." The question hung in the air between them like an accusation and a plea, demanding honesty that Isabella wasn't sure she possessed even for herself. How could she explain that jealousy had transformed her into someone she didn't recognize? How could she admit that her fears of losing his love had driven her to commit actions that made her unworthy of love? "I was afraid," Isabella said finally, the words feeling inadequate but truthful. "I saw the way you looked at her, the way you responded to her work, the way your face lit up when you talked about her contributions. I felt like I was losing you to someone who had everything I used to have: youth, enthusiasm, the ability to inspire others. I thought if I could just reduce her influence, you might notice me again the way you used to." Alexander listened to her confession with an expression that grew more pained with each word. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm, filled with 28 years of shared history that suddenly seemed fragile and possibly irreparable. "Bella," Alexander said finally, "do you realize what you've done? Not just to Elena, but to yourself, to us, to everything we've claimed to represent." Isabella nodded, tears beginning to flow as the full scope of her destruction became clear. She had indeed lost Alexander's love, but not to Elena. She had lost it through her own actions, her own choices, her own transformation into someone capable of cruelty disguised as policy. "The media investigation will probably be published regardless of what we do now," Alexander continued. "Elena's reputation will be restored, but the damage to the monarchy's credibility could be substantial. We'll weather that storm because we have to, but the cost will be enormous." "What about us?" Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer from the careful distance he was maintaining even in their private conversation. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as if the answers to impossible questions might be written there. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I don't know how we come back from this. I don't know how I reconcile the woman who helped me build a life of service with the person who was willing to destroy someone else to protect her own insecurities. I don't even know if the woman I fell in love